Hello, my name is Aurora Jones. This is an article review for Psychology 331-101 Human Sexuality with Professor Dr. Austin Jeffries. This is an article review of Sex Work, a Comparative Study by Bill McCarthy, Cecilia, Benoit, and Michael Jansson. What leads people to sex work? An examination of how life course experiences and immediate circumstances lead people to sex work compared to other service jobs like hairstyling and serving. So some key terms that you are going to need to know is sex work, which is going to be similar to prostitution. It's the occupation of sexual activity for some form of payment. Sex work can also be content or performances, and that some sort of payment can be financial material gain, shelter, drugs, and it's usually between consenting adults. Sex trafficking is a bit different. Life course is a sequence of socially defined age-graded events, roles, and roles that individual enacts over time from birth to death. So this can be things like sexual abuse and physical abuse. This can be drug use. This can be, education. Anything that happens from the time you're born to death is your life course and all of the experiences that you have along the way. Lifespan development. Again, I'll give you the general definition here: the scientific study of how humans grow, change, and maintain stability throughout their life cycle from conception to death. So this is things like holding a job, having a house, making sure you have enough food. Those types of things can push people to feel like they need to possibly do sex work to survive, right? So in our introduction here, there are two general ways of thinking about why people choose to start engaging in sex work. On one hand, you have the negative and traumatic childhood experiences, growing up in a lower class socioeconomic situation, being physically, mentally, or sexually abused, sexual assault, unstable housing, fostering group homes, being around exploitive people, homelessness, drug use, all sorts of things. On the other hand, you have immediate life circumstances in adulthood, which, yes, they are still compounding with other things, but usually in other studies, it was looked at as either childhood experiences or as adult experiences. There was no connection between the two. So you have, again, those compounding on job loss and instability, homelessness, economic need, human capital, which would be what are you good at, right? How much education have you had? How many jobs have you had? How many occupations have you been able to successfully do? Employment opportunities, food and housing, stressors, and especially if you have children or other dependents, like a partner without a job. In prior studies, as I mentioned, they looked either at one or at the other. And in the current study that we're talking about, they focused on trying to look at the whole lifespan, life course, and connecting the two, right? What in people's childhood made them more exposed to and more likely to do sex work as an adult, or as a young adult even. We'll get more into that. And what in their adult life made them choose to do sex work or continue to do sex work. Um, Participants in prior studies have often always been sex workers. This study chose to focus on a mix of sex workers and other service industry workers like hairstylists and servers. The studies rarely examined the relationships between the two, as I was saying, and the sample sizes were often very small or limited due to the legality of what the study is on, right? Sex work and prostitution is illegal in many places, so it is harder to find here. How does life course and immediate circumstance relate to sex work? What does sex work compare to other service industries like hairstyling and food and beverage service? As I've said, how do they compare? What were the life experiences like? What were the education experiences like, right? What factors may correlate between sex work and their chosen professions, and what increases the likelihood versus what decreases the likelihood of sex work? In our participants, they were from a study with 195 total workers from 3 different occupations. If you look over to the right here, sex workers, servers, hairstylists are all broken into 3 columns. I'll quickly go off a couple of the percentages here just so that you kind of get an idea. The sample size for sex workers was 212 sex workers, servers were 204, and hairstylists was 179. The total amount of people in this study were split between Victoria, British Columbia, and Canada, and around the greater Sacramento area. So in sex workers, looks like 82% of the participants were female, identifying 70% for servers and 83 for hairstylists. They were very curious in some of the more discriminated against or minority groups. So they looked at non-heterosexuals, racial minorities, immigrants, if they were single or if they were in a relationship. And if they were in a relationship, they don't have the exact numbers here, but if they were in a relationship, was their partner working or was the partner not working at the time? And then completed high school and average age. I do find it interesting that sex workers and servers were on average younger than hairstylists because you do have to go to school for a few years to be a hairstylist. So it was interesting to see, and it costs money to do, right? That the average age of hairstylists was older. The measures in this particular study for occupation, they were gathered and assigned different values, ones and zeros, depending on where you lived, what kind of job you did. If you had tried other occupations, if you had done drugs, all of those types of things were given numbers, so that they could be statistically analyzed. They also used life history calendars by Friedman, 1988, and those were used to note and kind of map out negative and traumatic experiences from childhood, and the including physical, sexual, mental abuse, as well as family and housing struggles if your parents had assistance, that kind of thing. Um, Human capital resources were also collected. So how many years of school did you have? Did you go to further education and continued education? Age of first employment, age of employment at current occupation, number of occupations, and number of occupations in the last 5 years. Two measures were used to look at economic needs, how many children were being provided for, and examine the difference between single people and those with employed versus unemployed partners. Drug use was also measured, with a focus on 3 hard drugs, which were methamphetamine, cocaine, and heroin. And I do touch on this a little bit, but I did not go too in depth with the drug use. We'll talk about that more later. As far as procedures go, the study took place in 2003 to 2007. It was a part of a 4-wave panel study for emotional labor, and it was used by the authors to review. Workers from all 3 occupations were hired and trained to perform interviews, which allowed for peer-to-peer interaction, which I think is super important. And they were also given the option to talk to a male or a female interview. These interviews often lasted an hour and a half or so, and they had open and closed questions, as well as some self-report options due to some of the more personal questions like drug use and obviously some of the things that happen in childhood. So they had the option to either mail in or telephone in those answers. Recruitment participants were done in a multi-prong approach. Some were done through a registry like the cosmetology list in the state of California. Some were found on internet sites and phone numbers. And one really cool thing they did in this study is a respondent-driven sampling technique, which was also successful, where respondents would then spread the word and the study about the study. And if they had people come in and do the study from them, then they would get paid per person that took the study, which was pretty successful, actually. So I really liked that. These are the things that increase the odds of sex work. This study found a higher proportion of minority demographics among sex workers. Maybe they're having a harder time finding a job, or they don't have a stable housing, right? Higher reports of negative and traumatic experiences across life course response, higher rates of social assistance needed or multiple guardians around when they were children, higher rates of physical and mental abuse prior to 15 and sexual abuse prior to 15. They had been in group homes or homeless or foster care, less education and job experience, higher reports of drug use, and both early life experiences and young adulthood experiences as well tended to lead them to sex work, right? So an additional parent or guardian percentage is at 15%, as you can see here. Parents receive social assistance, your odds raised by 99%, victims of sexual abuse, 80%, those who reported physical abuse, 90%. And one that staggered me was if you lived in a group or foster home growing up, especially prior to the age of 15, it raised your likelihood of doing sex work at some point in your life by 540%, which is crazy. Um, Results continued. This is the chance of working in the sex work occupation decreased about 45% with each year continuing education. Odds also decreased about 25% with each job the participant had held. These results indicated that the hypothesis, the human capital, and work experience does have an effect on the odds of sex work. And drugs were also correlated with participants in the sex work occupation, specifically with heroin. Heroin seemed to be a common denominator, and it was not really able to tell if it was that sex work made you more likely to try heroin or if heroin led you to sex work. Is the study was successful in adding to prior body work. So, as I said earlier, the one problem that was had with a lot of earlier studies was that they looked at one or the other kind of modes of thought regarding sex work, of it was either childhood issues or adulthood issues, right? And this study really examined the combination of the two, and it did show that there is a link between what happens in your adulthood and what happened in childhood, but even more importantly, what factors increase your odds of turning to sex work as a young adult, right? And when I say young adult, they do mean like 15 to 18, right around. A risk of those who struggle socioeconomically, who are minorities, who are discriminated against, are at higher risk, right? So, not in this study, but in our video from this week, I believe that Jeffries had said 42% of Black trans women have tried sex work in their lifetime. This is a highly discriminated against minority group, right? And so sex work is often the only work that they can get. There was a notable increase for those who were physically, sexually, and mentally abused, as well as those who lived in foster care and group homes, which is very unfortunate. And I'm hoping that Studies like this can help get information like that out to young people as they enter adulthood and be more aware of their options. There was some evidence of drug use correlated. Like I said, heroin was commonly used among sex workers in these studies. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation. Have a good night.